of it in terms as, as basically a situation that's mostly stable, and every once in a while it gets disturbed by something from the outside, like fire or flood, or in this case, maybe predation. And we tend to think of ourselves as being somehow separate from the rest of nature, whether that's as overlords or some other concept. Scientists do the same thing. As scientists, we always treat ourselves as though we're separate, which even though we know it's bogus. And then we think of ourselves as managers of resources, and actually that's kind of a limiting perspective when you think about it. It's a very economic perspective on the more than human world, but it is one perspective, and it is a true one. And so, but when we think that way, our livestock tend to become a very central focus for us, as we all know. And then we tend to see predation as like that thing coming from the outside, that a type of disturbance, and we identify it as a problem. So that's one way of looking at it. And what I would suggest is a little bit more holistic way of looking at it is if we realize, okay, all natural systems have disturbance as an inherent part of them. They're always cycling through some kind of disturbance cycle. And it might be easier to think of that in terms of fire or flood, particularly fire, right? Fuels build up, eventually it all burns. All those trees out there, all that wood, all that carbon, is probably going to burn someday unless we can figure out how to store it in the soil. Okay, so that's just one example from a different situation, but also we're trying to think of ourselves as a part of nature, not as something separate from it. And even in our language, we often realize that when we might say we know we're a part of nature, we still use words that represent concepts that indicate we don't actually completely think so yet. So, and you'll probably catch me doing that today. But especially in holistic management terms, we really try to train ourselves to think of the land as our central focus and figure out how to harvest that with a tool that we call livestock. And we also think of predation as one of those ecological processes. It can be a problem for us, though. But the important thing is we can manage processes. So not entirely, but somewhat. So as this pertains to wolves, they're coming back. They were relegated to Canada by the mid-1900s. Today, they're in the Northern Rockies and a few in, this is going to keep going. I don't know how to time what I'm saying to how fast it's giving it. But anyway, that's the historic range there. So the gray wolf is the native wolf of Western North America, basically. And right now there are two populations, one in the Northern Rockies, that's the blue area up there in primarily Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, a little bit in Oregon and Washington. And then there is this small area here, that's the Mexican wolf population. The Mexican wolf is actually a subspecies of gray wolf. It's the one subspecies that is unique enough to have warranted its own separate listing under the Endangered Species Act. So, but they are still a kind of gray wolf, as opposed to, say, the red wolf, which lived in the southeastern United States historically. So people have also identified, well, what parts of the Western US might still actually be potentially wolf habitat. As you can see, a lot of Western Colorado, parts of Utah, and parts of the Southwest are in that description. And that, of course, that depends who makes the map and what they think and how they measure it. But it usually looks something like this, if you're coming from a Colorado-centric point of view, where most of Western Colorado could be wolf habitat. So now in the Northern Rockies, it looks about like that. So every one of those dots is a wolf pack. Don't focus on exactly where the dots are. The point is overall, that's the region they cover. There's about 1,200 in Montana, 1,500 in Idaho, at least 300 and some in Wyoming. So it adds up to around 3,000 wolves. No, that's an identifier of the pack. Yeah, don't worry about that. This is a couple of years old. So those individual ones will have shifted by now. Okay, so Roland got me thinking about this too. Whether you're looking at this primarily from a livestock point of view or a wolf restoration point of view, we might be able to use some of the concepts in holistic management to help us think about it better. So one of those is the weak link. And I would argue that if you're thinking about this from the perspective of wolf restoration, the weak link is something along the lines of human tolerance. So wolves are habitat generalists. They can live anywhere from the mountaintops down to the desert, as long as there's something for them to eat. That something is elk, anywhere that elk occur. It's also deer, in some places it's moose. But in the Western US, far and away, it's elk. So, but yeah, so they can live a lot of places. If they're not there, and it's a place that has deer and elk, it's because humans have made it not possible for them to be there. So, and that is a component of the definition of habitat. Habitat isn't just food, cover, and water. It's also the conditions for a species to survive. And in this case, humans are the driver of what that means. So, and I would also submit that probably the weakest link in human tolerance for an animal like wolves is conflict with livestock. So, and you might say even more deeper than that, if you want to peel the onion, as Roland put it, maybe at the core is those human perspectives. There's also a couple of log jams we might identify, and they tend to be in the policy realm. So I would say with the Mexican wolf program, there's an arbitrary line drawn at Interstate 40. And if a Mexican wolf moves north of that, they capture it and move it back south for various reasons. But because of that policy, wolves are not recolonizing Colorado, for example, from the south. They're also not recolonizing Colorado very much from the north, and that's because of policies in Wyoming. So these are the wolves that would make it to Colorado on their own if they could. And a few have over the last 25 years, but not many. It's never quite been enough to establish a population. In fact, the only time we've had a male and a female get together and breed in Colorado has been in the last 2 years. So there is currently one pack in Colorado. It's up in Jackson County. Before that, there was one in Moffett County. But the reason that this has not been happening more than that over the last 25 years, Wyoming's policy has basically been to keep wolves in the northwestern corner of their state. So most people in Wyoming don't want wolves, and in 85% of the state, they can be shot on site year-round without even needing to have a hunting license. So that, of course, represents one perspective on how we should treat wolves in the Western US. And then, of course, the area where they do allow them is where most of the elk in Wyoming are. It's also the area where most of the land is federally owned anyway. And that's also why Wyoming has much fewer wolves than Idaho or Montana. They also don't have as many elk. So one might, if you're thinking of this from a wolf restoration perspective and thinking about, well, how are we ever going to have wolves restored in Colorado? You would identify this as a log jam using holistic management framework. And you would figure out, well, how do we release that log jam? What do? You put it on the ballot. You say Colorado is going to reintroduce wolves, period. And that's what happened, basically. So now, of course, we can think about this from a livestock perspective too. And there's at least a few ways. This doesn't exactly fit the chain of production model, as Roland put it up, the sort of sunlight to plants to livestock to the meat market, but it's similar. So in the seasonal cycle of cattle, we can clearly say, okay, there is a time when these animals are the most vulnerable, and that's calving. So the young are much more vulnerable than any others to any kind of predator. This isn't specific to wolves right now. But spatially, there's another way to look at it, and that's when wolves are spread out on the range, when cattle are spread out on the range, or sheep, but sheep are herded, so it's a little different. That is when they're really the most vulnerable, because that being spread out makes it A, harder for us to find them, B, easier for a predator like a wolf to find one and pick it off. So we'll get back to that in a minute. But most of the conflicts that you see in the Northern Rockies are on mountainous summer range of one kind or another. Most of that, of course, being Forest Service law. So, and then there are other sources of risk. Okay, so wolf livestock conflict. Yes, wolves do kill livestock sometimes. It's important to keep in mind, it's not as often as you might think, but it does happen. It tends to be very localized. It's not everywhere universally. For some reason, wolves might hit my ranch much more than my neighbors. And it might have something to do with what I'm doing, or it might not. But there are definitely ways to measure the amount of conflict. So what the most obvious is direct loss. So that just means livestock that have actually been killed by wolves. That number is actually really small in the Northern Rockies, surprisingly small. In fact, it's about 1/100th of 1% of all the cattle in counties that have wolves, which that's really surprising, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So, and it doesn't necessarily represent the risk of any one animal to wolves, because that includes animals that are in somebody's backyard. You know, they're not all out on the forest a lot. So it's not quite a fair assessment. And of course, it only includes the ones that are investigated and verified. So we know there's more than that. But even so, triple that, quadruple that, it's still a small number. And that doesn't account for other things. So there's what is typically called indirect losses. And that means, well, maybe your herd is experiencing weight loss or reduced conception rates because they're getting chased around by cattle, or excuse me, by wolves, which does happen. Best science is that's not happening to every herd in the Northern Rockies. That is happening where wolves are actively chasing cattle. So in some places, so if a ranch is having depredations, they are probably also having some other costs beyond that. And then of course, anything you might do to stop this or prevent it from happening has a cost in your time and labor. So, so you might want to keep in mind just some more numbers. There's a couple million cattle in the Northern Rockies. There's about 3,000 wolves. I need to update that slide. So that works out to something like 1 wolf for every 1,000 cattle, which is a meaningless statistic. It doesn't mean, don't take that to mean anything. It's just trying to help you like get your mind around the numbers a little bit, if you think that's useful. Okay, now they're in 5 different states, and those states count things different ways. So I'm going to zip back a couple of years to the last year that the data were collected consistently across all those states in the Northern Rockies by the federal government, which was 2015, published in 2016. At that point, there were just under 2,000 wolves, a little under 400 confirmed losses, most of those being in Idaho and Wyoming, about half as many in Montana, and then just a few in Washington and Oregon, which makes sense. There's very few wolves in Washington and Oregon relative to the rest of the country. And it's kind of split between cattle and sheep. Those numbers vary from year to year, usually a little bit more sheep, but most of the sheep are in Idaho and Oregon, whereas most cattle are in Washington and, in Montana and Wyoming. I didn't say that quite right. Montana and Wyoming have more cattle than sheep. Idaho has a lot of sheep operations. So, and in that particular year, about 17% of wolf packs in the Northern Rockies were known to be involved in at least one livestock depredation. So that's like 1 out of every 5 or 6 wolf packs. And we don't fully know why most wolves don't kill cattle. Some do. To some extent, it's a learned behavior, but that doesn't tell the whole story. That's just a part of it. Now, if you look at it over time, this is specifically from Montana and a little bit more recent than the last report I showed you. The trend hasn't changed a whole lot in the last few years, but what's obvious is it peaked in about 2009 and then declined again after that. So it does not exactly track the wolf population numbers themselves. And there's probably a few things that are going on there. And so, okay, and in this chart, this is, again, each one is a year. The blue ones are a newer way to estimate the wolf population. The white bars are the older way. In any case, it has actually plateaued. The wolf population in Montana is not particularly, it is stable more or less right now at around 1,200 wolves. And the reason it's stable is because they have hunting. They also have lethal control of wolves that are involved in conflicts. And then, but here you see that peak in conflicts. That's the dashed line back in about 2009. And, oh yeah, so the public wolf harvest is represented by that black line. Harvest obviously is a euphemism. So that does explain why population is stable. It does not explain why conflicts went down over that time. That's probably more representative to targeted removal of wolves that were known to be involved in conflicts. It's also probably in part due to use of proactive coexistence measures on ranches. So a little bit different way to look at it are how many complaints were received and verified by the state. And again, this one comes from Montana. Wyoming doesn't have exactly the same graph anywhere that I can find. But you see this peak in about 2009 to 10. And the difference between those two lines sort of represents all those dead animals that somebody called up and had the state or wildlife services come out and investigate. And they said, okay, no, this one wasn't actually killed by wolves. So they do seem to be getting a little bit closer together. And I just think that that probably represents that people are getting better at figuring out what likely is a wolf kill, and they're not calling about every single dead animal anymore. So, but there's always going to be a difference, because in wolf country, every carcass out there will have a wolf on it within 24 to 48 hours. So they will all have wolf tracks on them. The secret is figuring out, well, did the wolf actually kill it or not? So, all right, and this is costs over time. So in Wyoming, the peak in depredations actually happened later, kind of between 2014 and 17. And this, in this particular chart, they're measuring it in dollars spent on compensation for livestock. So again, I couldn't find this exact chart for Montana or Idaho, but the story is probably roughly similar. This particular, the last year of that chart was 2019. That year, Wyoming paid about a little over $100,000 in compensation, but they use a multiplier. So they compensate more than fair market value, for primarily because they know people aren't finding every single animal that was killed. So they also spent about $24,000 on prevention and management. I would argue that maybe they should be spending more on that, but that is what they're doing right now. And they spent about a little more than $1 million on their wolf program overall that year. And that seems to be typical. So if you're wondering, well, what's Colorado likely to spend on wolf management just overall for the foreseeable future, it might be around like $1 million a year as a ballpark guesstimate. Okay, comparing compensation costs in those states. Wyoming has the most because of the way they set up their program. They don't have the most wolves. They actually have less wolves than Idaho and Montana. And so that's because of that 7 times multiplier. That Wyoming accounts for about 2/3 of the total cost of compensation in the Northern Rockies. But if they didn't have that multiplier, if all the states paid the same way, Wyoming cost would be more like $50,000. And the total costs would be more like $220,000. But right now, in whichever year this was, 2015, it was a little over $500,000 for the Northern Rockies as a whole. So lots of things to keep in mind. This is that seasonal pattern. So the peak in, okay, the different colors here are years. The top graph is cattle and the bottom graph is sheep. So the peak clearly is in the summertime, and I'm quite convinced that that's just because of the distribution of livestock out on summer range. There's a smaller peak in some years during calving season, so that's the April right there, or for what in this particular year for sheep it was March. But wolves are not really everywhere in the Northern Rockies, so most operations aren't really facing wolf pressure during their calving season. Most of them are facing it when they're on their summer grazing lot. But some of them do have wolves right there during calving season. So again, like Roland, I would encourage you to think of this in your own personal context. And you can use the holistic management model for that or something else, but know that every context is unique, but some of the lessons do apply. So I'll let Roland go into all of that. But one point of the holistic management model I really do like beyond just defining your holistic context, it is asking ourselves the question of, well, how must I be to create that future I really want, far into the future. And to me, it's like, all right, it's so easy to say like, okay, everybody else should just agree with me. But the bigger question is like, okay, how should I be looking at this whole situation? And what do I need to do to attract the people who may disagree with me, but might be my customers? Cool. So now, strategies and tools to reduce conflict. There's a couple ways, or several ways at least, to think about these, like just how you divvy it up in your mind. I like to think of tools or strategies as being either proactive or reactive, meaning something you do before the problem happens or something you do after the problem happens. More useful than that maybe is some of these are focused on livestock, others are focused on the potential predator. And that kind of goes back to our perspective thing. If we really only think of it like the wolves are the problem, then we only tend to come up with solutions that are focused on the wolves, when maybe the solutions that are focused on our cattle might work better. So now, of course, the way people talk about this in public is usually about lethal versus non-lethal. I would suggest that's actually the least useful way to conceive of coexistence tools and strategies. And I'm quite sure that we are going to need to use both. So, and then if you want to really geek out on how some of these things work at an animal psychology level, you can look up aversive and disruptive stimuli, but I'm not going to try to explain it, so I'd probably get it wrong. Okay, here's an artist conception. What might ranch headquarters look like in wolf country? Obviously, this doesn't have to be your place, but the idea is somebody's kind of working in all these different tools and strategies and in whatever way makes sense for their own place. I would suggest that thinking of it in terms of strategies and tools as two slightly different things is helpful. So to me, a strategy is something that you kind of do all the time that reduces your risk, whereas a tool is like, that's a gadget, a gizmo, something like that, that you use for a specific time and place. To me, strategies, those proactive things, that's probably going to be the most important in the long run. And of course, the best strategies or tools are the ones that have brains because they can think and adapt. So that means us. It also means our animals, including especially our dogs, and to some degree our livestock themselves. Strategies can be things like strategic grazing management. So some of you are into holistic planned grazing. I would count that as a form of strategic grazing management, but also stockmanship. There's real reasons why low stress livestock handling works and can be beneficial. Of course, having livestock guardian dogs could be part of that. And a big one is carcass removal. So we'll get into that here in a bit. And then now there's the tools. And if these are what people often think about when they talk about coexistence tools, is these kind of things. So that's the things that make light and noise, or they're, rubber bullets, things like that, or a physical barrier. So a fence. Now, it's very hard to build a fence that's going to keep a wolf out. There's probably very few situations where that's the thing to do, but it might happen. And then there are other kinds of fences that work psychologically. And flattery is one of those. We'll get to that in a minute. This is a fox light. It is one of the sort of light devices. Now, obviously, this doesn't physically affect a wolf. It's all psychological. They don't know what it is. The inventors of this in Australia wanted it to have the look of a person walking through the brush with a flashlight. And so apparently in Australia, you go out fox hunting with a rifle in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I don't know. They think that that's going to scare the foxes, and it seems to work. There's evidence it works with snow leopards in Asia, and I've actually had some success with this in the Northern Rockies, but it's not a silver bullet. Neither is flattery. Flattery is a really cool tool. It's all these nylon streamers that are sewn on to a piece of polywire. So that's, does this have a, oh, whoa. That's what I get for trying to use the laser.
You're looking for a pointer?
Yeah.
Let me see. Let me get this back. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to rely on Penelope to fix my mistakes.
Hopefully.
Okay. So I won't point at it.
Oh, shoot.
At least not with the laser pointer that I don't really have. So most of you have probably used electric fence, I'm guessing. I tried that one. I don't know. Middle? You guys think I should try it? Okay. There we go. All right. Don't push these two buttons. Okay? Cool. So a piece of polywire, single strand polywire, with all these flags sewn on. So, and they're about 18 inches apart. The idea is that a wolf can't slink under that thing without touching one. Well, they don't know what it is, and wolves hate anything new. I mean, if you think ranchers are neophobic, go talk to a wolf. Okay, so something like this, there's video of wolves pacing back and forth, trying to figure out how to get through this, and they can't figure it out because they're like, well, I'm not touching it. And so now, all these tools are scarecrows, right? They don't last forever. Sooner or later, they'll figure it out. They'll find the weak spot. But it might be long enough to buy you some time. There's evidence that this can work for up to 2 months in a particular place. And it's been used different ways. In this case, it's around the outside of a pasture that's also fenced with barbed wire. That's probably the most common way it gets used. It's been used to, say, put around a carcass to keep that carcass undisturbed until the investigator can come out and determine whether it was killed by a wolf. Meanwhile, you have a wolf on the outside trying to figure out how to get in. And so there are cool ways to use this. Now, so back to my assumption that you're probably familiar with electric fence. This is a lot more complicated than running a single strand of polywire out there. So I would say it's about an order of magnitude more time and labor cost to put up a mile of flattery than it is to put up a mile of polywire. So just keep that in mind. I would recommend this for like around a calving pasture, something where it's relatively small because you're feeding hay and you're going to be there for a while because you're feeding hay, something like that. I'm not recommending that this gets strung across the Southern Rockies. So here's a fence that's meant to keep bears and wolves out. I'd say it'd probably have to be a little bit higher than that. Again, you're not going to build this kind of fence all over the Southern Rockies, but there are places where it might make sense. Bone piles are a major attractant especially for bears, but also for wolves. And most ranches have this somewhere because animals die of all kinds of things, and then you have to either leave the carcass where it was or move it somewhere else or do something with it. The thing is that animals that scavenge these, they will find it here and they will keep coming back to this spot for years because they got fed there once. And that's interesting because sooner or later, it puts them in proximity with live cattle. So I'm not saying that they acquire a taste for beef by eating carcasses. That's almost certainly not the case. I am saying that sooner or later, these carcasses end up putting wolves in the same place with live animals that then sooner or later, if they're together long enough, something will happen. So some of the best programs in Montana, for example, have been like everybody in a watershed gets together and figures out how do we all haul off all of our carcasses during calving season and put them someplace where they're not causing a problem, usually behind one of those kind of exclusionary fences. The other big one, livestock guardian dogs. This one that's been a little bit more slow to get adopted for a variety of reasons. Those of you who have sheep probably already have livestock guardian dogs. That's been actually pretty typical for the sheep folks for many decades now. It's never become typical for cattle folks for a variety of reasons, mainly that cattle are spread out over much larger landscapes. And if you can't ride out in the day and see all your cattle, a guard dog can't do it either. So I won't get into this a whole lot right now, but there's a good video on YouTube that my friend Steve Prim made, features a guard dog breeder and some of her ideas about it. There's actually a lot of stuff to read about guardian dogs on the internet. Cool. So now the two things that I think are most underappreciated in terms of their ability to prevent some of these conflicts are grazing management and stockmanship. And that's what I'm going to get into a bunch now. So now, a little explanation. When I talk about strategic grazing management, I mean something like what Roland would say when he's talking about holistic planned grazing. So not necessarily synonymous, but similar. And the idea is some form of creatively determining how that grazing happens on the landscape. So not so much like a grazing system in the old fashioned sense, but more like systems thinking and creative management. And if you know what targeted grazing is, it would be kind of similar in concept to that, except on a much larger scale and much coarser. So targeted grazing, of course, implies a real fine scale decisions about grazing management. But the core thing is that it's adaptive or creative. And for those of you who do like holistic management, you might call that plan, monitor, control, replan, which means about the same thing. So the reasons to think that there are connections here are, in my opinion, pretty significant. So we know now that there are valuable reasons why strategic grazing management works for land health reasons and for livestock production reasons. But as far as applying that to living with wildlife, especially predators, that's a little bit more in the hypothesis stage, but there is a lot of experience and a lot of evidence in the wildlife literature that implies that it might be true. So this is, if you want to learn more about grazing management, this is a special issue of the Rangelands Journal from 2013. And I'll leave it at that. Well, I'll also say that think about it in terms of changing the distribution of your grazing, not just across space, but also over time and plant species. So, and that's all because the problems we have with grazing tend to be spatial. Cattle will really over-select for certain spots on the landscape. This is one science study, and the colors represent the amount of time they spent there. Another way to think of it is, say, like riparian areas, for example. We all know our cattle love them, and we would like them to graze everything else cheap. But it is a spatial phenomenon. That's a grazing patch, you know, and one of the reasons this stuff works is because when land deteriorates, it's usually not deteriorating everywhere universally all the time. It's a very spatial thing. So it happens in one place, it gets worse, and that spot then starts to spread and get bigger. And so when we change the way we manage our cattle, we can change that process. So for those of you that know Alva Leopold, considered the father of wildlife management, as one of the early foresters. I would argue that what he was doing in the early 1900s is actually range management. No one's ever called him the first range manager except for me. But that term didn't exist yet when he wrote. And I'll use some of his quotes too. Okay, this is the ranch I used to manage. It's actually just up the hill from here on the other side of Sierra Summit, between there and Gunnison. This is the old Jim Howell's place. Some of you probably know Jim. And I had an opportunity to run this place for 3 years because he was busy starting the Savory Institute and Grasslands LLC. So it kind of worked in my benefit, I guess. But we had a case study. This is in that Rangelands Journal. And we basically showed that if you can use small paddocks, high stocking density, short grazing periods, and long recovery periods, all the hallmarks of rotational grazing, but especially if you do this adaptively, to even out the distribution of that grazing across time and space together. So cattle are not always that densely concentrated. I just took a picture because they were densely concentrated that day. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. Looks like that from space. Steep country. So these hillsides never used to get used. Creeks, the cattle spent the whole summer in the creeks, and when you have that going on, it doesn't matter if you have a conservative stocking rate, because the fact of the matter is the good spots on the landscape are overstocked and the rest of the landscape is understocked. So needless to say, there was degradation down there. This is going back historically before I was around. And Jim figured out, well, what if I just run polywire across these canyons? I don't need to fence out the riparian areas. I can use them, and I just kind of stair-step my cattle up the canyon over the course of the season, and give every part of this creek at least a year, maybe 2 years to recover. And I just keep kind of moving the fence, so I'm not building new fences all the time. And that worked. Creeks came back, willows came back. But the important thing is is able to give them access to the good stuff and the rest of the stuff together and move them around the landscape that way. This is a hillside cattle never used to use. That's cattle up there. In fact, they went over it where there's no one had ever bothered building a fence before because they didn't need one. So I had to get like 300 cattle out of a subdivision one day. Because our management improved faster than our infrastructure. Okay. Yeah. And I'll just say that by doing all that on this place, because I happen to have data on it, Jim and then I were able to run a lot more cattle. Initially, okay, so we're going to arbitrarily call this 100%. The absolute numbers don't really matter. Think of that as like a baseline. And then when Jim started doing strategic grazing back in 1997, he was immediately able to run more cattle. So that's not because the range is getting better. That's because he changed the way he was using it and made some of the grass that was previously unavailable available. In fact, he probably overdid it for 2 years. I think he would now say he overstocked there. So if you kind of ignore those 3 years and then you ignore the 2 driest years in recorded history, you actually see somewhat consistently is able to run about 1.5 times as many livestock. So that's the benefit of this. Now that number changes depending on the severity of the previous distribution problem. So it was this least range that was the largest acreage, and that's where most of those canyons are. It was actually able to run more like 2.5 times as many cattle. So I'm going to skip that. So back to this idea, take that and apply that to coexisting with wildlife, especially the potential predators. There's reasons to believe that'll work. And I'm just going to give you, I'm going to show you a couple clips out of a film that's
prevention of conflict probably has more to do with the way that livestock are managed and the patterns of their grazing use on the landscape than it does with direct interactions between people and wolves.
That's why landscapes can withstand so much grazing, is because they get grazed in any one spot, maybe intensively at one point, and then the herd moves on and doesn't come back for a certain period. And often that period is long enough that plants are fully recovering from the grazing event or the next grazing event. That is tied to the presence of predators. It's not just that say the bison or the elk did that naturally before humans came along and messed with everything, because there were predators on the landscape. When we manage our livestock in ways based on those behaviors of native grazing animals, we should be able to reduce the likelihood of predation events, and through that, then be able to increase human tolerance for these large carnivores.
So that's kind of the idea. Another Leopold quote, all the wildlife people love Alvin Leopold, and I do too, actually, I really do. And this is the one that gets quoted all the time. But what's interesting to me about this is if you go back and look at his life, he wrote this story at the end of his life in the 1940s about an incident that actually happened in 1910 when he was one of the early forest rangers and shot a wolf. This was probably on the Black River in northeastern Arizona that this happened. But to me, what's interesting is anyone who studies Leopold can tell that his attitude towards wolves evolved slowly over the course of a lifetime and a career. But I think as a literary device, he kind of condensed it into this one moment, which is interesting. I actually think the truth is more interesting than the story, even though the story is very well written. And I had a sort of green fire moment of my own when I was on this ranch, and we're talking about grazing in nature's image all the time. And we never lost a calf to predators. But what was interesting to me was that these cattle learned that they could run off a potential predator. And that happened on this irrigated meadow. There was a coyote den somewhere right in there in this particular picture. Those black dots are cattle there in that pasture. But they learned that they could run those coyotes off. All they had to do was mob up and act like one collective meta organism, so to speak, also just known as a herd. And I couldn't take the ranch dog around anymore because they were going to stomp that dog to death. And they weren't just curious yearlings, like they meant it. So I just thought, well, wow, this is really interesting. You know, I'm sure thousands of other people have seen essentially that same thing. But to me, it flipped a switch in my mind. I was like, wow, there are things we can do and we're doing on this ranch for other reasons that would actually help prevent a lot of these conflicts. So cattle being at a density like that learned this behavior. So I thought that was really cool. And that's actually why I left Colorado and moved to Montana for several years. So I was trying to figure out, how do we apply this in the real world? I also think that's an example of cattle practicing adaptive management. So here's another clip out of this rough cut here.
So what these animals are doing, this exhibits the natural anti-predator behavior of almost all grazing animals, and actually many other taxa of animals too. So that means mammals, birds, fish, all grouped together like this in response to potential predators. That's throughout the world, all throughout the animal kingdom. That behavior seems to be stronger in some animals than others. It's especially strong, for instance, in bison. They're very famous for it, actually. Bison are much harder to kill than elk are for a wolf. A lot of that is due not just to the large size of the bison, but to their behavioral ecology. So bison are much more likely to stay in a large group and not run away from a possible predator. And if we can get that behavior consistently in our cattle, they will be less likely to be seen as easy prey by a potential predator like a wolf. So for a wolf to kill one of these, what they would do is scare them into running. As the herd is running, it makes it easier for wolves to figure out, well, which of these animals are going to be slower or otherwise weaker, something that's going to make it an easy one to kill. The way wolves will kill a prey animal of any kind is to attack its flanks and hindquarters. And so just getting them on the run essentially exposes the weaker side of the animal to the wolf. Wolves can run all day long, so they're highly unlikely to be outrun by any prey animal out there. The benefit of being in a herd, in a nutshell, is safety in numbers, but there's a little bit more to it than that. So what it enables the herd to do is for each individual to spend less time and energy being vigilant, looking for predators, and more time and energy on foraging. Okay. So in the science literature, there's a lot about that in the wildlife material. It's not in the range of livestock material yet. But what I was just starting to talk about is this idea of the many eyes hypothesis. Scientists really love it when they can name their hypothesis. Like, that's a really cool thing to do. But there's other reasons why this works too. So predators might become confused about which animal they want to take, and in the meantime, the herd gets away. This idea of the selfish herd hypothesis, that's like, okay, if we're all in here and we know a predator is going to come through that door and take one of us, and we don't really know how it's going to choose one, our best bet is to sit close to another prey animal. And that's how we maximize our own individual safety, even if we know the predator is going to get one of us. And then if you put all that together, it's called, also known as attack abatement. So you can look all these up. These are what's called passive anti-predator behaviors. And they also lead to active anti-predator behaviors. So this is like those cattle running off the dog. This is the standing their ground, protecting their young, and actively fending off predators. So it's a little bit different, but they go together. And you can find all kinds of stuff about this in wildlife ecology science. So, and I would also say that the converse is true. Scattered individual animals are easy prey, even if they're a big, powerful bull elk. So just keep that in mind. Now, for us, what that might look like is some form of not just aggregating into a larger herd, but obviously then you have to move it around. You can do that with either rotational grazing or herding. And depending which of those tools you're using, you would measure this in terms of either stocking density, animals per acre, or the herd instinct of the herd, like their intentionality to stay in this herd. So I'll show you a couple projects, and I'm going to have to go faster than I have been. These have all been developed collaboratively, mostly when I worked for people in carnivores up in Bozeman. This is something my friend Garl is running his family ranch on this forest allotment.
and some folks from Montana State University and another consultant, we came up with these plans. The idea is, well, whatever plan you've got, we might subdivide a little bit with temporary electric fence, but we'll mostly use it herding, and we'll just make it a little bit more intensive. So if you've got a 3 or 4 pasture rotation, that's good. Let's figure out how to take that and improve on it. That's where it is in southwestern Montana, kind of between Greater Yellowstone there and the Northern Continental Divide area up there. Oh, and this is on the grizzly bear map, so I haven't said anything about grizzly bears, but this area does have grizzly bears too. And that's where it is right there. So his idea was, well, all right, let's herd these cattle, and we'll use a mixture of really intensive herding and putting them in a little paddock made of flattery, and that worked. So he did this for a couple summers, had never had a single loss to wolves, but really worked himself and a couple of interns really, really hard. This calf was actually born on the forest allotment. It did survive, interestingly enough. Not necessarily recommending that, but that's what happened. So herding, when I talk about herding, I'm really talking about low stress herding. That means using the methods developed by Bud Williams and written about extensively in the Stockmanship Journal if you want to learn how to do it. Kind of a pressure and release thing. And what we had done on that first project probably was not true stockmanship according to Bud Williams. So turns out Whit Hibbard, one of the world's experts on this stuff, now that Bud is gone, lives in northwestern Montana and invited us to do a couple projects at his place. On the grizzly map, it's right there, kind of at the northern or southern end of the Northern Continental Divide, west of Helena. And this is a seasonal custom grazing operation, not unlike the one that Jim Hallow used to have up here between Montrose and Gunnison. But he gets cattle from several different places. So they come with several different brands on them, and they tend to self-segregate into their own little social groups. But it's these smaller groups that are kind of vulnerable. So we just wanted to train them to get together, tried a couple things, herding them intensively, but with maybe not the best methods combined with night penning. And then we said, okay, let's get this whole night penning thing out of here. It's too much work. Let's just focus on herding. And then went back to the original thing after that and kind of compared them all. So this is high density. Herders could make these cattle stay together. 250 animals per acre. Garl just rode around with his cell phone and measured that for fun. But to make that work, they had to be penned at night. And that's a lot of labor. And so we wanted to see if we could take that part out, just gather them from water in the afternoon, herd them, and then leave them somewhere overnight. So here we are. This is trying to encourage that herd instinct, taking them on a cattle drive. Doesn't really matter where they go as long as they like the experience of going together and getting somewhere. Did this for several days until the effect of them spreading out overnight diminished over time. So this is about 5 days into it. We finally got the result we wanted, which was all 380 some of these cattle staying together. And took this picture about 24 hours later. So we basically stopped doing the herding once we got that result. And then this fellow that I was working with was like, I really like the way we started out doing this when we just kind of like really encircled those cattle and moved them around like a lawnmower. I wouldn't try that again. So I was like, yeah, I don't really think that's the true low stress way, but sure, let's try it. So then we tried to place these cattle here. They looked kind of happy and we left. Came back the next morning. Doesn't it look like I know what I'm talking about? I love this picture. And they had spread out all over creation again. So we had to gather them, and it was kind of embarrassing. We didn't realize this, but we actually put more stress on those cattle than we thought with that encircling method. So if you're going to do this, I would really go study the Bud Williams methods and try to get your mind around why it works. And so an expert could have told us what we were doing wrong, but we couldn't see it. So that's kind of the lesson there. This is one area that did get grazed pretty hard. a lot of manure, and it came back gangbusters. And then we used that to kind of plan our next project. I'm going to skip this one actually, because I realized that I'm talking longer than I thought, and take you to instead this one in Wyoming. So this is in the Wind River Range, an allotment with two herds that when we started out were not staying together. They do have grizzly bears and wolves both. This is right there at a spot called Union Pass. And that's where it is on the grizzly bear map. And this is where it is. It's a perpetual hotspot for conflicts. So mountain lions, wolves, more wolves, grizzly bears, Southwest cubs, they're all up there. Yeah. And so we thought, well, okay. And we wouldn't have done this if the permittees weren't on board with it. This was partly their idea, partly mine. Forest Service was on board with it. So we had Steve Cody, who's another stockmanship guy, wrote probably the original book on stockmanship. He came out, did a workshop. He really likes to make you start this stuff on foot. Blake, my friend, the ranch manager there, he looks a little frustrated. I think he's got his hand off or hat off and one hand running through his hair. We also brought Whit Hibbert down to give a workshop that was sponsored by the local conservation district. And then here's the idea. So we take these cattle out, herd them. If we can see this kind of lawnmower thing, we'd like to encourage that. But again, mainly we want them to have a good experience while they're being herded, so that the herding is not teaching them that they don't want to be in this herd. We want the herding to teach them that they do want to be in this herd. So right there, the rider's riding reverse parallel there. She turned around, started to go forward, but of course she turned back. Doesn't really matter. Figured it out and fixed it. It's good to have a bunch of people doing this, except that if you have too many people, things don't go so well. I also like this picture because me, Whit, and the permittee are all on horseback, and the Forest Service folks are here too, leaning against the horse trailer. So I like to tease them because they're actually really good range cons up there on this Shoshone. But in the picture, it kind of came across funny. So this is gathering a small group that was separated from the rest and just bringing them to the main group. A bunch of this stuff goes on presumably every day, but in reality, not really. Permittees have a lot of other things to do besides this. The important thing is to settle them somewhere that hopefully that you think is relatively safe. There is no safe place ultimately though. The safe place is the herd itself, but make sure that if you have one that doesn't want to settle down with the rest, that you don't leave until she does. She could take this whole herd away, or worse yet, take half the herd away and leave half there. So some of these places are bottlenecks. This particular stream crossing this particular day happened to be one. And I think the real reason was we had too many riders out there with too many different ideas. And it actually worked better the next day when we only had 2 riders, and they were both on the same low stress page. And this wasn't a big deal at all. And we never lost a calf or anything to wolves or grizzly bears on this particular project. Even though I got some wolves and some cattle on the same trail camera on the same day, as far as we know, they didn't even interact, let alone have a conflict. There's a bunch of bears out there. I put this camera on a post and thought I'd never get anything because there was a carcass out here somewhere that you can't see. But within an hour, a grizzly bear came by, so he probably watched me put it up. There's a bunch of them up there. This one decided to go rub the camera, and I think that's how a bear flips you the bird. So the important thing is we were able to get these cattle to stay together better, not 100%, but a lot better than they had been. And that was enough to stop all depredations on this allotment. So this is just kind of comparing 3 years before and 3 years during. And prior to, okay, so this is the total losses to all causes on this allotment across both herds. And these are the ones that were to predation by some combination of bears and wolves. there's a couple of probables in there. I'm not really sure where they came from, but none after we started herding. So, and that's so down from about 2 to 3%. But there were other losses going on. Turned out these were mostly pneumonia related, and in one particular herd, not the other. My friend Blake, the ranch manager.
Blake practices holistic management. He's got a grazing plan based on those ideas and how we can best use this country.
Yes, holistic management seems to incorporate a future landscape that you envision more than a lot of other philosophies do.
Part of the holistic model, I guess, is that large ungulates behave differently in the presence of pack hunting predators, and that's how the landscapes have evolved to be what they are. So having cattle that they in a normal frame of mind and can deal with things that happen in this world without losing the cool.
They got to have that, still have enough that predator-prey relationship in them to operate. But that being said, that's part of the handling. It's a stockman relationship. They should understand that you're not a threat.
That united front deters a lot of predation. We don't generally have too much trouble with them. North of town, I guess, they have more issues than we.
So that's Blake. Oops, there we go. He went to Western, by the way. So this is it's the rough cut. It's tentatively called the Range Riders. My friend Susan is the filmmaker. And there's a whole lot more in it. I just cut out some pieces that I'm in that are to use for this. But I'm only one character out of like 10 in reality. It is still, it's very much still in production, so I'm not sure when it's going to come out. And I think now she's going to change it because time has passed since she started. And yeah, so it won't be tomorrow. All right. So anyway, in all these cases, basically wherever we had some kind of rotational grazing and herding together, we were able to stop the livestock losses and prevent any management removals of either wolves or grizzly bears. There's one major exception. And with just herding, we were able to get most of the result that we could get with a rotational grazing plan, but not have to use the fences. Of course, the flip side of that is you have to do the herding really well, and you can see where I didn't do it very well. There was one exception to that, and this is a place that has a lot of grizzly bears already conditioned to killing cattle, which is an exception within the Northern Rockies. I mean, most grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies are not killing cattle, but in this particular place they are. And in that place, we were not able to demonstrate a result. So all these things really work much better as preventative than they do as a cure. And the other thing that I've really learned over the time is that all these other tools, whether it's people on horseback, dogs, or the mechanical stuff, they all really rely on a small area. So you can use these to keep something away from your ranch headquarters, but they're tied to a place. They're not tied to the animals. So they don't necessarily work out on the range. Well, I mean, obviously range riders and guardian dogs do, but it depends on the scale. So the larger the scale, the harder it is for any of these to work. But you can shrink the scale you're operating on at any one time with good grazing planning. So one more example, this is a place in Idaho called Alder Spring Ranch. You might follow them on social media. If you don't, I recommend you do for a lot of reasons. They're doing a lot of things right. And they're probably one of the best living examples of everything I'm talking about. It's a large place, a pilot project. They're trying to do a couple things here, which is, to me, this is the right thing. I mean, figure out how to do whatever you're going to do to prevent predation, make it fit the rest of your program. So mostly they're herding their cattle to avoid having too many cattle in the creek bottom for too long. And the side benefit of that is that they're not having wolf conflicts. So they're also using night pens, but not all the time. But again, this is labor intensive. It does cost something to do this, except that they're getting people to come do it because people are signing up from all over the country because they want to do this. It's very interesting. Follow them on social media. They have a really good presence out there.
What side of the herd are they running with that? What they say, 2 or 4?
I don't remember, but it's a large allotment. I imagine it's on the order of several hundred, but I don't know for certain.
They have 400. They run yearly.
Okay. Yeah, and they're also marketing it as grass finished beef ultimately. So they're doing a bunch of things that are all out of the box in various ways. But they work together. So it's kind of like a stacked enterprise type concept.
I just wonder how many head you were running on the rangeriders like videos you were showing.
So let's see, the one in that place in Wyoming, that they started out with like between 100 and 200 head, and over the years built up to about 600. On Wood Hibbard's Ranch, it was between 300 and 400 a year. It's a custom grazing deal, so it varies a lot from one year to another.
Yeah, you're saying like usually work better on smaller scale, so I'm sure.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is don't just go buy a smaller ranch, but use your grazing planning to split that landscape up so that on any one day, all your cattle are in a small part of it. And then, as opposed to scattering them everywhere, because you can't be everywhere.
Right.
Yeah. So, but it does take work. I don't want to kid anybody about that. And so wherever you're thinking about this kind of stuff, I would encourage you to think about context, and I would encourage you to think, not like this tool works, this one doesn't, or that won't work here, which of course is what everybody says. But think about it as like, okay, what out of all that could I figure out how to work into what I'm doing on my place? So, and by context, what I mean is partly that landscape context, and we just basically talked about that, but also the management context, and those two things go together. So if you can figure out management context in which some tools might work that otherwise wouldn't have worked, that might be to your benefit. But all of these tools, they all work some of the time. None of them work all the time. And it has a lot to do with how committed people are to making it work. So if you've got cowboys that really are offended at the idea that they might be asked to put out some fox lights, they're probably going to find a way to make the fox lights not work. Don't blame that on the lights. But more importantly, though, think about it in terms of strategies, not just tools. A tool is not a strategy. A strategy is something much bigger and much more proactive. So, and just this is my own kind of back to Aldo Leopold one last time. This is other slightly less famous, and he's usually misquoted. So people usually think, and he actually borrowed this idea from Thoreau. People usually think it's about wilderness. It's not. It's about wildness. And I think he was hinting at a wildness in what we now call working landscapes, which of course is a phrase that didn't exist yet then. But I think he's talking about a wildness that's not only in plants and animals, but in us too. And I'm going to have to wrap this up. There are a bunch of resources out there if you want to learn more about this, some of which I contributed a little bit to. One of my favorites is this one put out by Western Landowners Alliance, written primarily by Rick Danver, who you might know from Deseret Land and Livestock in Utah previously. Now he's based in Wyoming. The reason I like this one is that it's written from a landowner's point of view as opposed to from a conservationist point of view. So I think it might resonate with people a little bit better. CSU put together a whole huge compilation of all the science they could find relative to what it might be like to have wolves back here in Colorado. You can find it online on the CSU extension page or the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence page. It's called the People and Predator series. There's a whole bunch of subcategories. The one on wolves and livestock addresses some of these issues, not all. Interestingly, this is also the most controversial of all the things that CSU put out. So there's a lot of folks in the livestock world who think that biased towards the wolves, and a lot of people, all the people in the wolf world thought it was biased towards the livestock. So hopefully that means it was somewhere in the middle. I don't know. This is a pocket guide that my previous employer, People in Carnivores, put out. The idea is that you could put it in a Carhartt pocket or something. I've never seen anybody carry it around in a Carhartt pocket. But there's good information in there and it's a lot shorter. And then you can find my stuff on ResearchGate or academia.edu, including this paper. So this is the one that's kind of the science behind this talk. And if you find me there, you'll find this. And you can contact me any of those ways. And I think I have like a minute or two left. So I'd happily try to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
I'm a little curious that there's not more predation incidents in the wintertime. It just would seem like food might be harder to find for the wolves, and cattle concentrated and more vulnerable because they, especially deeper snow. So anyway, that's surprising. I thought that's where we might see some more conflicts.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought about that a lot too. So you're right. And I think what it is wolves have a tremendous advantage in the snow, for one thing. They love cold and snow. That's where they thrive. Elk are more concentrated during the winter. So I think killing elk becomes really easy for them during the winter. In fact, if you've ever heard of surplus killing, for example, when wolves actually kill a little more than they really need at the moment, that's a rarity. It does happen, but it's really unusual. And it only really happens in late winter and early spring when the snow is deep and the prey animals are all really stressed and they have a harder time getting away. So you're right. That is like when the wolves have the most advantage. But I think what's happened is that's also a time when most livestock operations in the Northern Rockies don't really have a lot of overlap with the elk and wolves, whereas they really do during the summer. So I think that's really the key.
Just for example, I have small cattle herd that winter right in the foothills of the West Elk Mountains, where it's high concentration of elk area. So often, there's a herd of cattle and a herd of elk very close proximity.
Mhm.
In a situation like that, will the wolves go after whatever the easiest prey is? If, they're there because the elk come down out of the mountains, but will they tend to still go after the elk, or will they go for the slower?
So they generally tend to go after the elk, but the more they're exposed to cattle, the more likely that sooner or later they'll go after cattle. And in some of these cases, especially if the elk and cattle intermix, they might start out chasing elk and accidentally sort off a couple of cows. I think that actually probably has happened very recently, but I couldn't swear to it because I wasn't there. Yeah, so your highest risk is if your cattle are where the elk are. So your best bet is to not be exactly where the elk are at any one moment, if that helps. Yes, ma'am.
There was something that I saw, and I think it was in Idaho, with some gentleman that was training his cattle, actually, to have her to stay together and to turn his face, dog-like predator. And I thought that was an interesting strategy to use, actually. He was working them in a small space, or teaching him not to run. Really.
Yeah. Do you know if that was Glenn Elzinga or Steve Cody?
I don't remember his name.
Okay. It might have been one of those two guys. Yes.
So I just thought it was interesting that you said that the reason in the winter time is because the prey are bunched up, but you were saying a strategy for cattlemen is to keep their cattle kind of bunched up. So why did that not work with elk as much as when it worked with cattle?
So the thing about having a cluster of animals, it works two ways, right? If the wolves know where they are, they don't have to go find them because they're all there. So that works in the wolves' advantage, but that is still their natural defense to group up, because when they're sorted off in small bunches or single, once a wolf finds them, they then become very easy prey. So it's always a tension between, are you less likely to be found, but what if you are found, then are you more or less likely to survive an encounter? So, and keep in mind, like most encounters between wolves and prey animals don't actually end in a successful kill for the wolves. So like in Yellowstone, it's fewer than 1 in 10, maybe closer to 1 in 20 interactions between wolves and elk actually lead to a meal for the wolves. So So even elk have strategies to get away from wolves once they've been found. So just keep all that in mind. Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite answered your question or not. Okay. Yeah.
Surprised you didn't address horned cattle at all. Is that something the guys up there in those kind of high conflict areas are doing it all, or is the cost of, the problems with horned cattle is too great without with?
I strongly suspect it would work. I just don't know anybody who's been able to show that yet. For sure, I mean, similar to that, bison work great. And Ted Turner's not having very many conflicts on his huge place up there. But I don't expect everybody to just decide they're going to switch to bison over this particular issue. But I think a point I am trying to make, though, is that cattle can learn to behave more like bison than we generally expect them to. So, yeah, and of course, if sheep are more highly vulnerable, you could switch from sheep to cattle, and some places have done that, but not very many. Obviously, that's asking somebody to make a huge change. I don't really want to ask anybody to do that, but yes, you could.
I was going to say, do folks with ranch land, they run beef pastures. Why they have them.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think beef master cattle might actually have more of this innate behavior than some other breeds too. And there are some people looking at that very question with criollo cattle down in Arizona and New Mexico, especially. But they don't have wolves or grizzly bears, but they do have cougars, and they might have Mexican wolves at some point. So yeah, people are definitely interested. Yes, ma'am.
How do kind of the tools, I know the practices, kind of systemic, like holistic management, things transfer between different predators. Do you know how some of the kind of more key tools would translate to like cougars or black bears and other?
Good question. So I think the answer is kind of yes and no. The proactive stuff probably translates to pest.
Yeah.
So that doesn't really rely on the predator being a specific species. The gadgets are less likely to transfer. So things like flattery, that particular tool is totally specific to wolves. I don't know of any evidence about it working with grizzly bears, but I kind of suspect it might a little bit. Yeah, and those lights were specifically designed for canines, but there's evidence that they work with snow leopards in Tibet. So that one might transfer. But again, remember though, those are all scarecrows, so they won't last forever. Yeah, you got to use them when it makes sense. Cool.
Well, let's give Matt a round of applause. And we'll have our last plenary session, which will be a very creative water panel in the auditorium.
I was talking to a sheep guy. And I said, well, why don't you increase your dog? Or have more of that? He says, well, the coyotes cut them out. And he says, no, I said, so it's not working. I'm sitting there going, well, I didn't think those guys would beat the bird down. They would just run far enough. Is that how those guard dogs work?
I think it depends on the individual and the breed. So, I mean, guard dogs definitely work with sheep. And it's because the sheep are typically herded, they don't get scattered. So guard dogs work really well. But some of them will roam, some of them will really stay with the sheep. I think the best thing is to have a mix of breeds. And a gal I know with goats just called me and said she had a cougar get into her pen. Like she had like a 4-foot goat pen, and obviously a cougar, that. I was like, well, I mean, you could make it taller. You could add some poly wire on the top. And the recommendation would be like at least